Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Really excited for this conversation and to be part of the New Orleans Book Festival. I'm Allan Carey. I'm the Director of Sphere Education Initiatives at the Cato Institute. It's a pleasure to be here introducing my colleague and talking about her book. So this is Chelsea Follett. She is the Managing Editor of humanprogress.org. She's also a policy analyst at the Cato Institute in the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Chelsea, thank you so much for being here and for your book. While we get started, I want to begin by asking Human Progress. It's an unusual name for a project. Tell us a little bit about what's the project all about and why get excited about Human Progress?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that kind of introduction. So if you turn on the news, you will be quickly bombarded by all sorts of negativity. It's very easy to get the impression, with all of the very real problems that we still have, that the world is getting worse, perhaps dramatically so. But if you zoom out and look at the big picture, we've actually come a long way. And as managing editor of humanprogress.org, I spend a lot of time thinking about where that progress comes from and how we can continue to make progress, to improve living standards, to increase life expectancy, to decrease malnutrition, to move toward a more peaceful, wealthy, healthy, prosperous world. And that simple question of where does progress come from is what led to this book, Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World. Because thank you. Yes, it's got a beautiful cover design as well. When I first set about making a list of different aspects of the modern world that we so often take for granted, everything from the rule of law to writing to basic sanitation, I found that many of these different innovations could be traced to specific places. And I didn't start out intending to write a book about cities, but what I found was that even when the vast majority of people lived in rural areas, it was disproportionately cities from which progress emerged, or the closest equivalents that existed at the time. There was a long stretch of history before anything that would meet the modern definition of a city existed. And that got me thinking, well, why cities? And why some cities and not others? What causes one city to become a center of progress and innovation? And there are some common threads that unite the very diverse cities in this book that I'm sure we'll be discussing shortly.
Absolutely. So I love that notion, right? So we're talking a little bit about the idea that progress is a thing that happens in part because something about when people are together, they engage in thinking about problems, challenges, opportunities. But progress doesn't seem to happen just sort of spontaneously. What seems to be that driver of progress? You mentioned it tends to come from cities. What is it about getting people together in close proximity that encourages those kinds of progress to happen? And I suppose to layer question on question, what are we talking about when we say progress? What are the examples of those kinds of things?
Those are both great questions. I'll start with the latter one. So sometimes when people hear the word progress, they have a politicized definition in mind. It makes us think of the word progressive, but really, I'm talking about progress in the most non-controversial, non-partisan way possible. Things that people across the political spectrum, wherever they are in the Overton window, would agree make life better. At humanprogress.org, we start out with the definition of progress that our advisory board member, Dr. Steven Pinker of Harvard University, puts forward in his book, Enlightenment Now, where he writes that progress includes, he writes that being alive is being better than being dead. Being healthy is better than being sick. Being literate is better than being illiterate. It is better to be fed, safe, free, have access to civil rights than the reverse. We live today in a world that would be alien to so many of our forebears, so many of the people who have come before us. I'm actually at work now on another book called The Grim Old Days, An Introduction to the Pre-Industrial Past, that tries to paint a vivid picture of just how different the world of the past really was. But it was a very violent place where lives were short, cruel, and difficult, where poverty was extreme and the average person was not a healthy middle-class individual, but a peasant laboring away at subsistence agriculture throughout their lives. So you may disagree with this very basic definition of progress, relying on living standards that we all take for granted today. But as Dr. Pinker wrote, if you are alive, healthy, free, literate, and so forth, you are in no position to turn your nose up at those values. And so most would agree that this is a necessary start. So by this definition of progress, have we made any progress as a society? I would argue yes. And the reason why it does tend to emerge from cities is just what Allan was saying, people. It seems to be the case that wherever more people gather together, engage in discussion and debate, in exchange of ideas and goods and services, they are able to help one another to uplift their living standards and change the world.
I love that. And I think before we go too much further, we should probably acknowledge an uncomfortable truth for this room. New Orleans didn't make the cut of the top 40. My apologies. But it almost did. So we were talking about this, that New Orleans was one of the cities that was on the cusp of making the list. What for?
So there is a chapter in the book on music, because I wanted to have a broad definition again of progress in this book, not just material living standards and scientific and technological innovations, but also cultural enrichment. So there's a chapter on sports, there's a chapter on painting, there's a chapter on architecture, and there's a chapter on art, and there's a chapter on music, which focuses on the classical music of Vienna. But music is such a broad subject. I thought it would also be really interesting to have a chapter on modern music. And what would have been the 41st city was actually New Orleans. We had an illustration written up, but the book was getting quite long, and we probably could have gone on to 50 cities if we'd wanted to, and New Orleans just barely did not make the cut. I'm obviously regretting that now, being in this room.
Second edition, maybe.
Yes,
we added
if
a
you
bonus
all
41st chapter.
This be a bestseller, and we come out with a new edition. Maybe we can add some additional cities, an expanded version.
I love it. Well, let's talk about some of the cities that you do cover. So, a wide spectrum from all across the world, involved in so many different important pieces. What are sort of we're at a book festival. Let's talk a little bit about books and printing and literature. There's several cities that touch on that. Which are the ones that you would say, taking a look at it, this was one of the most fascinating places that gets to the printed word and how that has to do with our conversation today?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So an additional factor that unites many of the cities in the book, besides just being cities, being relatively large population centers, would be that most cities in the book seem to reach their creative peak, their innovative golden age, during times of relative peace. And I say relative because if you consider the past as a foreign country, as they say, it was a very violent one. No place in the past would meet our modern standards of what we consider peaceful. But cities tended to reach their creative peak in times of relative peace. Not all of them, of course. There were some exceptions, and one of them would be Mainz, the city that Allan is alluding to. So Mainz was the city where Johannes Gutenberg created the printing press and had many different printing apprentices. And the city was not peaceful at all. It was filled with riots, civil war ultimately. There were many years in which he fled the city and then returned and fled and then returned. This was sort of his pattern over time. And eventually the discord got to be so great that there was a huge diaspora of people fleeing the city and the chaos there, including many of Gutenberg's printing apprentices. And this is credited with actually spreading the printing press throughout Europe with incredible speed. If you look at a map of where the printing press was at different points in time, it was a rapid adoption. Now, the lesson that I take away from this chapter is not that violence and discord are good for progress, but that even when you have all of the wrong conditions for progress, sometimes something good can still come of it. Now, obviously, there are people who disagree that peace is a condition for progress. Many people believe that war drives forward innovation. Matt Ridley, in the foreword that he wrote for the book, notes that this is something that is often credited with the creation of computing and the internet. But if you look at people who were actually working on this technology, early forms of it, people like Konrad Zuse in Germany, various Americans, various other Europeans, they were separated because of the war that was occurring. Even the various American researchers were not able to put their heads together, to work together on these technologies because of the secrecy inherent in war. Now, we can't rerun history, rerun the experiment, and see whether or not we would have ended up with these technologies faster had there never been world wars, but I think it's entirely possible. Maybe we would be far more advanced in terms of AI and all of these technologies now.
Are you telling me I'm missing out on my flying car because of war? I'm
Quite
very
possibly.
unhappy about this. So one of the things that we've talked about in the past as we've talked about the book is the relationship between many of these cities and the ideas of openness, of plurality, of a sort of freedom of speech or related ideas and being able to communicate information. And it seems like a natural corollary to what you were just talking about, the extent to which cities bring people together and where in cities people can engage across challenging ideas. They can build, combine, recombine, and push for interesting solutions. Is that a fair way of putting what you see in some of these cities?
Absolutely. The three major factors that I saw uniting these very different cities in the book would be people, peace in most cases, and last but certainly not least, freedom, including the freedom to discuss a wide variety of ideas. And the chapter that probably best epitomizes this value of openness would be the chapter on Amsterdam during the Dutch Golden Age. Now, if you look at a graph of the history of average income, GDP per capita, or life expectancy, actually, they follow a very similar pattern. What you'll see is that there is a very long, flat, straight line throughout most of history where life expectancy and income were essentially stagnant, growing, but very, very, very slowly, all the way from the time of Christ and Caesar until around the time of the Industrial Revolution, when suddenly this long, flat line shoots upward, starting in some countries and then others, and grows exponentially. This is often called the hockey stick graph of history because of its shape, with this long shaft and then the upward facing blade. And that great takeoff in living standards, in average income, and in life expectancy that completely changed the world. Many scholars believe that it actually began in the Netherlands. It was centered in Amsterdam. So how did this obscure fishing village, which no one would have seen as a great site of progress, suddenly change the world? How did it end up giving us the earliest stock exchange, one of the earliest forms of the corporation? How did it have all these different innovations in finance and in art with the Northern Renaissance? How did all of this happen? And there are obviously many possible factors, but one thing that I think was very important to the success of Amsterdam and what made the city so creative was this incredible sense of openness. It was open to many very different kinds of people. This was during Europe's wars of religion, and Protestants and Catholics were not getting along. But in Amsterdam, different Protestant denominations actually were allowed relative freedom, and even Catholics were allowed to operate to some extent, although their churches had some restrictions. Jewish refugees were allowed in that were fleeing other conflicts in Europe, and also not only were they open to different religious ideas, but different ideas of political philosophy. John Locke, the father of liberalism, took refuge there for a time in Amsterdam when his ideas were not welcome in the United Kingdom. And Thomas Hobbes, an absolute monarchist, all the way on the other end of the political spectrum, as far from Locke as you could get, was able to publish his ideas in Amsterdam when no other city in Europe, no other printing press wanted to touch them. They were too controversial. The fact that Amsterdam was open to people of so many different backgrounds and beliefs and political philosophies allowed them to engage in an incredible amount of experimentation. And only when you are free to discuss new ideas, even controversial ones, are you able to perhaps hit upon a new idea that actually changes the world. And as that economic growth skyrocketed during the Dutch Golden Age, and there was suddenly so much wealth in the city, that then fueled many other forms of progress and innovation, such as the incredible artworks. Actually, in Amsterdam at one point, there were so many painters there per resident that it's estimated that in many houses, the walls are just covered with beautiful paintings. There are doll houses surviving from this era where every single wall is just covered floor to ceiling with paintings, and people thought this was unrealistic at one point, but then they looked at the actual number of painters living per capita in the city and thought, okay, that makes sense. It was an incredible time. And so in the Netherlands and then England and later the rest of the world, we got this incredible uplift in living standards, all thanks to they're trying new things, a new approach.
I love that. It's an incredible story because it shows that even in an environment that was by no means perfect, as you mentioned, still many limitations, still a whole variety of challenges, the more you move toward embracing a handful of principles, that really unleashes an incredible amount of creativity among the people that are there. It becomes a haven for people thinking about new and different ways of engaging in things. Are there other cities that you would point to that say, as they started to embrace something similar, you see progress, you see really interesting outcomes sort of after Amsterdam? Who else embraces that approach and leads to some really exciting things?
Oh, that is a great question. London, there's a great quote by Voltaire on the London Stock Exchange, which came later than the one in Amsterdam, but that still captures the same sort of spirit. He wrote that in the London Stock Exchange, people from all nations come together for the utility of men. He wrote that in the London Stock Exchange, Jews, Christians, and Muslims treat each other as though they were of the same faith. The Anabaptist trusts the Presbyterian, and the Quaker accepts a promise from the Anglican, and so forth. And this economic incentive to better each other's condition helped bridge the gap between people with very different beliefs and backgrounds. And so it was a sort of virtuous cycle. When you have more openness to different sorts of people, when you have more intellectual freedom of belief, freedom of religion, and so forth, you get more ideas, more exchange, more wealth. But then that wealth also can create an incentive for people to work together and to overcome their differences. And London did a lot of impressive things throughout history, but it's featured in the book for its role in ending the global slave trade, which I think we can all agree is a very significant form of progress. And I think many people don't realize that, or they don't think about how at one point in human history, slavery, torture, so many different things that we now consider abhorrent were just universally accepted almost everywhere in the world. And so not only have we come very far in terms of material progress, not only have we created the wealth to fund wonderful artistic innovations, but we've also made a considerable amount of moral progress.
I think that's a tremendously important point, right? That so many of these ideas of progress are deeply interwoven with each other, that as one is possible, the other becomes possible, and they reinforce in really interesting ways. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other cities. When you write a book that covers 40 different cities, often the first question that you're going to get is something like, well, what's your favorite? What's your favorite city? I'll throw out one that I particularly love, again, because we're at a book festival, is Kyoto, in the role of introducing the novel. But as you think about, as you were writing the book, which were ones, we'll take a slightly different angle, so not necessarily favorite, but the ones that surprised you most as you were researching, where you said, in thinking about this, writing about this, I've come to realize this is a really fascinating place in ways that I hadn't expected ahead of time.
Absolutely. I'd say that Dubrovnik was a really interesting city to learn about while doing research for this book. I didn't know much about it prior to this book, but during the medieval period, Dubrovnik was called Ragusa, the Republic of Ragusa. It was a free city-state, and they were unusually devoted to freedom for the time. Their motto was in Latin, "Liberty is not sold for all the gold in the world." Their flag was just the word libertas, Latin for liberty, in red emblazoned on a white background. They were actually, if you count a city-state as a country, among the first countries to ban the slave trade. So they were unusually devoted to freedom. And when the bubonic plague struck Europe, in many cities killing a third or even half of the population, it was devastating. And Dubrovnik was able to come up with a coherent public health response to that pandemic that actually let them not only continue to flourish during it, but achieve significant mercantile expansion when similar city-states like Venice, also very reliant on trade, actually were shutting down. So what did they do? They instituted limited quarantine waiting periods for ships arriving at their ports that actually allowed them to continue to keep those ports open and operational and allowed them to keep trading and to grow their wealth. Whereas Venice, again, for example, because it was a very comparable city, actually had to completely close its ports to the outside world because of repeated outbreaks of the bubonic plague. So I think that we can learn a lot from the example of Dubrovnik. And it's a city I didn't know much about. It was sort of medieval Hong Kong, this trade-dependent seafaring supernova that became very prosperous through this openness to trade and through innovations, such as the response to the pandemic they faced.
Whatever happened to Dubrovnik?
Well, now it is a tourism-oriented city, as I think many people know. And you can, if you go there, visit the ruins of where they would have these quarantine waiting periods. Obviously, quarantine was not an ideal solution either. It's much better to simply have antibiotics at your disposal, but they did not. As I've learned recently, my 1-year-old is actually recovering from scarlet fever right now, which used to have about a 30% death rate, but now is easily treatable by antibiotics. Just another way that we've come very far from where we were that I don't think people spend enough time appreciating.
Absolutely. So what I wanted to get into next, you talked about this idea of the human the hockey stick of human progress and prosperity, which often can lead us to think that perhaps progress is inevitable, that these things will sort of continue on their own, right? We've had some good things, and we built on those good things, and other good things are coming. So what's there to worry about? And as you talk about in the book, and as we've talked about in previous conversations, it turns out, unfortunately, that's not true. So why is it mistaken to think that perhaps progress is inevitable? And what instead does that mean that we need to do to ensure more progress happens?
That is an excellent question, because while this is a book about progress and it's an uplifting book in many ways, there is also a darker lesson from this book, which is that many of these cities only had their innovative golden ages for a very short period of time. In many cases, it was like a flame that flickered very briefly and then was extinguished. One of the cities featured in the book is Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, during the Abbasid era. And today, Baghdad is not a city anyone would think of as a center of progress. It's one of the most dangerous cities in the world. But it wasn't always that way. There was a time during the Islamic Golden Age when Baghdad had what was called the House of Wisdom, a sort of proto-university where scholars from many different backgrounds, many different origins, were all invited to work together in a pursuit of truth. And they made incredible discoveries in the realms of astronomy and mathematics and so many other areas during this time. They allowed scholars from different religious backgrounds even to operate, again, at a time when religious discord was the norm and not an exception. And so you can find examples of Christian scholars, for example, rising to a very high rank during this period. But then a different faction took over the city, and they had a much more closed view. And they had a very different interpretation of Islam than the previous ruling faction. And suddenly, the entire atmosphere of intellectual freedom was extinguished. Everyone was much more constrained in what they could say and what they could do, and many scholars were not allowed to operate because they did not have the right background. And not only did Baghdad lose this important condition for progress, freedom, but they also lost the condition for progress of peace. The ultimate downfall of Baghdad came in the form of invasion. It was said that during the Mongol invasion, the river actually ran black with ink because so many scholarly works were lost during this episode of violence. And so I think there is a good lesson there that the conditions for progress, openness, freedom, relative peace, these are very fragile and they can be lost easily. They need to be treasured and safeguarded. Progress is not linear. It can go, change is a constant, but progress is not. Things can go up and down. There are many cities in the book like Mohenjo-Daro, a ruined city, now it lies in ruins, in what is today Pakistan. But it was built up by the ancient Indus Valley civilization, and they had incredible advances in plumbing and sanitation that actually surpassed even the famous system of the later Roman Empire. And that was huge for the health of the population because so many preventable deaths in the past, especially among children, came from poor sanitation. And yet, that city that now lies in ruins also seems to have met its end, possibly due to violence, due to a loss of the conditions necessary for progress. We see again and again cities that were global centers of innovation can end up in ruins. They can end up being very inhospitable places to live. And so just because you live in a place that today is a center of innovation, that doesn't mean it will always be that way. You have to really treasure and safeguard the conditions. And that's another reason for writing this book and for the website of humanprogress.org. I don't want people to simply gain historical perspective and realize that we've made progress, but also for people to think about and discuss what they believe the conditions that drive progress are. Because if we can correctly identify those conditions, if we can figure out what policies and institutions allow us to make positive change, then we can protect the progress that we've made and we can continue to make progress in the future.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And I want to talk a little bit about first something hopeful and then perhaps something a little bit less exciting. On the hopeful side, as you take a look at the world around you now, right, where do you see budding centers of progress? So there's so many interesting cities, so many interesting places around the world leading to really exciting changes in how we're looking at things. If you were to say, have to pick a city out of a hat for 2025 and say, here's my bet on where we see progress next, where might that be? And what are some of the things that lead you to speculate that it might be there? What's some of the principles in action that you were just talking about?
Another lesson from this book is that it is very hard to predict what will become a center of progress. I'll get to a prediction at the end of this answer, I promise anyway, but it's very difficult to predict. From Amsterdam rising up from an obscure fishing village to Edinburgh, another great example of this. Sometimes it's the cities where you would least expect progress to occur that end up emerging as world-changing innovators. Edinburgh had just come through many different years of discord from various disasters, the failed Darien scheme, different bits of political turmoil. When the Scottish Enlightenment occurred there. So what took this obscure, cold, inhospitable city that was just coming off of decades of turmoil and turned it into a hub that changed the world? Again, it seems to be openness and people engaging and debate. This was essentially a small university town that really punched above its weight. The reading societies of Edinburgh allowed people to discuss many different ideas, including controversial ones. And this city gave us, oh my goodness, so many different innovations in architecture. They gave us the foundation for what in the US would become the Federalist style. It was said that all matters of taste were decided in Edinburgh at one point. Thomas Jefferson said that they were the center of science, and sure enough, they had so many different groundbreaking scientists. The foundations of geology came out of Edinburgh at this time. There were great medical innovations happening. And of course, also, they gave us modern social science, including David Hume and the empiricism, and also Adam Smith and the foundation of economics. All of this came out of a town that people would not have expected at all for this to come from. Whether it is the reading societies of Edinburgh or the marketplace of ancient Athens or the salons of Enlightenment era Paris, wherever people are able to come together and discuss ideas, many different ones, wherever there's a true atmosphere of intellectual freedom, that seems to be what fosters innovation. And so when you're trying to identify the next big hub of progress, that's what I would look for. Freedom, intellectual freedom, an atmosphere of openness. One possibility that has been presented to me would be Austin, Texas. They've got that saying, keep Austin weird. To the extent that that's true, to the extent that people are allowed to be weird and different and to come up with new proposals, I think that that has incredible potential to change the world.
I was trying to give you a softball to say New Orleans again.
New Orleans, well, yeah, sometimes I do that. I just say the city where I am. So New Orleans, I also
great
like
book festivals here.
That's true. There are so many different universities here, and also, you've got the reputation, the big easy of being a place where people are more easygoing, and some might look at that as oppositional in some way to progress. But I don't think so. I think that when you take it easy, when you don't get upset and offended when someone has a different idea or a different approach, when you really are able to relax and hear one another and engage in civil discourse and discussion across vast differences, that's when progress emerges. So I could see New Orleans also being a candidate.
You really saved that. I love the way you brought it back together. I wanted to talk a little bit next about your current book project. So you mentioned it in passing at the beginning, working on something that you're referring to as Grim Old Days. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about, one, what do you mean by the Grim Old Days? And two, what are sort of the ties to that project and this one?
They may seem like opposite projects, with one being about these hopeful moments of innovation and progress throughout history, and the other one clearly being about grimmer and more grotesque aspects of the past. But I actually do see them as very closely related. Sometimes I'm asked which of the different centers of progress featured in this book I would visit, if I could visit any, if I had a time machine. And the answer is none of them. I would stay in the present day where I can read the philosophies that came out of classical Athens without witnessing the sale of slaves in their marketplace, when I can behold the paintings that came out of Renaissance Florence without fear of contracting the bubonic plague. Mm-hmm. We retain access to much of the best of the past while having overcome so many different horrors that I think people forget about. And that's what this book is trying to draw attention to. Even the most innovative and wonderful places in the past, for their time, did not meet our modern standards. The past truly was, as the saying goes, a foreign country, but it is not a country that you would want to visit. And so this book goes through the different aspects of an ordinary person's life in the past, from birth, childhood, education, work, what sort of food they ate, what sort of home they lived in, all the way, what sort of medical care they had, what sort of dentistry they had access to, all the way to their old age and death, and tries to show what their life would be like. And it is not a pretty picture at all. By reminding people just how terrible the past was, my hope is, again, to foster appreciation for how far we've come, some historical perspective on our present problems, which are real, and there are many, and, again, to foster conversations on how we can overcome these problems that we still face.
So it's safely far enough away from lunch at the point that we've had this conversation that perhaps you can humor us as you're starting to take a look into that. Mm-hmm. What are some of the more particularly gruesome or surprising things that you've learned as you're taking a look at what dentistry or any number of other things happen to be in those grim old days?
Well,
what's one curious thing?
There are. It's hard to pick just one because there are so many very disgusting aspects of the past, but if we're all right with discussing very disgusting things. So it's pretty well known that most people enjoyed poorer health in the past than we do today, right? About half of children did not make it. They had a much lower average life expectancy. And a lot of that came out of the fact that they had very poor sanitation in the past. Even the Palace of Versailles, it must be remembered, did not have bathrooms. The level... We think of the past sometimes prior to industrialization as very clean, as smelling like flowers, clean air. Everything was lovely before what the poet William Blake called the dark satanic mills, these smoke-belching smokestacks of industrialization. But actually, the past smelled terrible. There are a lot of first-hand quotes you will see in the book of people describing how terrible it smelled. If you've ever been to a farm, you'd probably know that farms don't smell very good, and most people did live in rural areas on farms. But even the cities, even the most advanced cities of the day, if you look at London, if you look at Paris, it was not good. Their cemeteries were literally bursting at the seams. Their giant stacks of excrements could be smelled throughout the city, and actually people who opened up the sewers to clean them in the very intermittently, they were not cleaned very often, sometimes died of the smell. It was that bad, and the fumes could catch fire. It was not clean in the past. Another thing that I think people don't realize is that the past was not as environmentally friendly as a lot of us imagine prior to industrialization. There's this idea many people have that prior to factory farming, all animals were treated very well. They lived good lives on these little family farms. That's not exactly true either. So before the railroad, before industrialization, it was not easy to get milk from the countryside into a city without it spoiling, and so many cows were actually kept inside cities in very poor conditions where they could hardly move, and their milk tasted so bad it was known as blue milk. It was not very nutritious at all. There were pigs roaming the streets. This spread illness and created all sorts of other problems. And at one point in England, during the early modern period, so again, prior to industrialization, it was actually illegal to sell unbaited beef. Does anyone know what baited beef is? So bull baiting was this sport in which special dogs were bred. We've all heard of bulldogs, right? This was sort of the predecessor to them. Were bred to latch on to a bull and not let go. While breeding these dogs to do this, they would sometimes cut off their feet and see which dogs still stayed latching on, and those were the ones that they would go on to breed, to produce dogs that had this instinct to just bite and continue to do so, even as they were being torn limb from limb. So they'd send dogs at bulls who were tied up in pits or chained, and the dogs would latch on, and the bulls would kill them with their horns and their hooves. And the last moments of these bulls were spent in torture and panic. Today, actually, there is a very carefully designed system for slaughtering cows that tries to keep them calm right up until their final moments. Designed by a woman named Temple Grandin, and a specialist who has autism and who used her perspective to understand exactly where the animals were coming from and how they perceived the world. It's very thought out, every single aspect of it, to try to keep them calm. That's not the case in the past. In the past, they intentionally tortured animals right up to the moment of slaughter, first for entertainment, and also because they thought the beef tasted better. They had this theory that it would somehow tenderize it if the animal were panicked right up to the final moment. Oh my gosh, there were so many other forms of environmental degradation. I could go on and on.
Well, you've largely convinced me the past is very bad. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I'd love to turn our attention back to now and thinking about the key lessons. So if you could tie a bow sort of on the conversation so far. We've been thinking about the role that cities have played throughout history in setting the stage for incredible innovations that have improved both the physical, economic, and moral conditions of life, right? Increase that measure of progress. As we look to say, here we are now, what is your quick recommendation to us all? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to encourage to be sure that we see more progress and less whatever the past was, less of that?
That is an excellent question. I think it comes full circle to what we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation, which is that it is people who drive progress forward ultimately. So don't wait for it to simply emerge. Don't think that it's this inevitable flow of history toward ever better living conditions and you can just sort of sit back and hope that everything will get better. Try in your own life to encourage this sort of civil discourse, this atmosphere of intellectual freedom that we've been talking about. Try to be open to different ideas, try to be respectful in these discussions, and try to tone down this increasing divisiveness that we have seen, unfortunately. We're now at a point in our culture where many of the foundations of the progress we've made may be at risk. We are seeing less openness to people of different backgrounds in some areas. We are seeing more restrictions on trade, current trade wars we are seeing. Also, just in our everyday lives, we're having a harder time talking to people who disagree with us. And when people aren't allowed to express new ideas, that also precludes the possibility of new ideas that change the world. So I think that's about sums it up. Basically, all the values that the Sphere initiative is promoting.
Come back next year for a talk on that.
Yes.
Again, the book is Centers of Progress, 40 cities that changed the world. Chelsea, thank you so much.
Thank you.